Hi everyone. I'm going to give you a few comments on our specific discussion of kin selection, altruism, and sexual selection. Maybe. There we go. So after viewing Phil's response and the group summary, that was very cute, by the way, one of the things that came out that I want to make sure that we all remember is that all of this, everything in evolution, is an extremely complex process. And we're looking at genomes that have thousands of individual genes and several genes coding for one observed trait. And so there are a lot of things going on. In order to help with understanding, I think sometimes we try to simplify it, but we do need to remember that it is extremely complex. There was an article that I cited in a response, and there's a quote below that I really, really loved to remind me about this. And that is, for every complex problem, there's a single answer, and it is wrong. And I know that that's probably not always the case, but it does seem that often the answers are much more complex than we want to make them. Um, some of the things that Phil mentioned that are important to remember is that there is no lasting perfection. Um, and I know his exact words were far more catchy than mine, but that is true to remember. Also, another idea that he presented was that those traits that we see as negative may be relics of another time, or they may just be variation at this given time, but that those evolutionary mechanisms are constantly at work. We had a significant discussion on altruism and some other altruistic traits like empathy and kin groups and things like that. Again, Phil mentioned this, and I'll mention it as well because it's just that important. Altruism is a trait of a population, just like any other trait, and it can be selected for or against, and often is. Um, there are trends that swing back and forth between altruism and uh, what we sometimes refer to as cheating when it comes to that. Just like we see those swinging trends between an increase in predator numbers and prey numbers when we look at natural selection. Um, I also wanted to make sure and mention as well, and we had again several really, really great examples in our discussion on this, that altruism, excuse me, and empathy are often anthropomorphized traits, um, but they're not solely human traits, and that's something to remember. We talked quite a bit about sexual selection. It is, again, just another mechanism for selection, much like natural selection. Um, in any given organism, there are some traits that are selected for sexually and some that are selected for in other ways. Um, in an earlier discussion, I noticed some comments about females perhaps not being able to find a suitable male and therefore not reproduce. And just remember that that's not the case. Seldom do we simply not, we and as in organisms in general, simply not reproduce because there's not a suitable partner, but we would reproduce with a less suitable partner and therefore presumably have less suitable offspring in that given environment. Another thing to think about, and in humans this is referred to as the sexy son hypothesis, that occasionally the traits that we are choosing for in sex selection are not necessarily traits that benefit the survival of the offspring immediately, but traits that would benefit them when it comes to sexual selection as well. We talked about parental investment, and one thing to notice is that the parent who gets to be the choosiest um, is often the one who does not have the strongest degree of ornamentation. So in typical patterns, and birds are a really classic example of this, the males tend to be more colorful or have these really long tails or large beaks or things like that that perhaps are meant to attract the females, whereas the females are more plain. Um, and there are different reasons for that, but we also notice that that is a trend among many organisms. And when the males are the ones who are choosing, perhaps there are fewer female, or I'm sorry, more females and fewer males, or the parental roles are reversed, that often it's the females who take on those more ornamented looks to them. And again, remember, as in all of these, we talked a little bit about raptors and things in the discussion, that the explanation is rarely super simple. There's often several factors at play. We talked a bit about polyandry, and there were some really interesting examples that came out of that. Um, some benefits of polyandry are increased genetic diversity, greater proliferation of offspring, increased survival rates in the offspring, um, and potentially more fit offspring when it comes to things like sperm competition and things like that. There are times when the practice of polyandry is due to the available number of mates, and in some species can change based on environment. And then there was a little bit of talk about reasons against polyandry. Um, and it seems like this differs in species, but there are species where perhaps the need for male investment or an imbalance in, or I guess a lack of imbalance in the numbers of males versus females in a population might cause a species to be less polyandrous than they may have been otherwise. And that's all I have for this discussion. I think that Phil's summary and the summary of the group were both really, really great, and the understandings presented by you all in this discussion were pretty on point. Um, and again, just again to tell you, great job, and I really enjoyed reading all of the crazy examples that many of you went out of your way to find. It definitely livened up the space, so thank you.